66 creepy-ass stories that will ruin your day. I read these at night and I could not go back to sleep. I heard creaks and shuffling in my room. I'm not sure if it was my imagination. I ended up playing Red Dead Redemption all night long. Please, excuse me, Mr. Marston. Found on Ask Reddit. 1. About 5 years ago I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance-walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him and to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments I felt relieved until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time staring at him. And then he started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated, tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone. Except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray or my cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there completely frozen as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again about a car length away from me. Still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What the fuck do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. What the fu? Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around very slowly and started dance-walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go until he was far enough away to be almost out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way. And this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. 2. I'd been living alone for less than a week. I got some Chinese takeout and was eating in front of the TV. I finished my meal and cracked open the fortune cookie. It read, "You will have a visitor tonight. Lock your door." There were no visitors that night, but the memory still haunts me. 3. I watched in horror as this drunk-seeming guy fell, maybe it was on purpose, but I don't know, onto a commuter rail track just as the train was coming. The sound/sight of him getting run over, crunching, splattering, awful, has stayed with me for life as the scariest brain-scarring thing ever. 4. I was on vacation in Ithaca with my boyfriend at the time. We had literally, I'm talking 10 minutes, just gotten into town and stopped at a suspension bridge near Cornell's campus. I'm terrified of heights, and so my boyfriend was coaxing me step by step over the bridge. It was gorgeous, and we stopped at the middle to take a picture. On the side we had come from, there was a parking lot with steps leading to the bottom of the gorge, but on the far side there were hiking paths with no barrier. A woman walked past us and offered to take a picture for us. We declined, and she smiled and walked quickly to the far side of the bridge, where she smoothly jumped off into the gorge. There was not a second of hesitation. It was almost like she expected the path to keep going. The sound of a person hitting the ground from a jump like that sticks with you. I'm set up in this small clearing, probably 40 feet across. Get my campfire going and pitch my small one-person tent. Do all that camping stuff like cooking hot dogs on a stick over the fire and s'mores. I probably stay up a good 2 or 3 hours after dark. It was mid-autumn, so the days were somewhat short. The entire time I thought I heard shit moving in the woods on the edge of the clearing. I didn't think anything of it at first, because the woods are full of animals, but as the night went on, I realized that whatever it was just circling the clearing over and over. Once I started paying attention, it made 4 or 5 laps around before I decided to get up and investigate. The noise stopped as soon as I stooped up, and I thought I heard some sound going away through the woods. I just shrugged it off, thinking it was some fox that was curious that got scared when I stood up. I decided it's time to sleep, douse the fire, and climb into my tent. I start to doze off and stay in that half-asleep, half-awake state for a while. I normally hear weird shit when I'm in this state, so I don't think much of it when I hear a voice. Something wakes me all the way up, though, and I realize the voice is real and right outside my tent. It's just above a whisper, and I'm not sure if it was another language, or if they were just speaking English in such a way that I couldn't understand. I lay there for some time, I don't know how long, listening and waiting for something to happen. There's just enough moonlight to light up the walls of the tent, so I can see when a hand presses into the wall of my tent down near my foot. This freaks me out, and I sit up quickly. Whoever was outside of the tent tore ass out of there, like running full sprint through the woods. I get out of the tent and shine my flashlight around and see nothing. I was expecting there to be a bloody handprint on the tent, but nope. Didn't sleep that night, packed up camp at first light that morning, and booked it to the cabin. But then she started hearing some noises coming out of the basement, like pans falling and stuff. She just ignored it and thought it was the washing machine or something. Anyways, a little later she starts hearing the noises again. She decides to call the police and tell them she was hearing noises coming out of the basement of the house she's babysitting at. The lady at the station told her there's a patroller in her area and that he'll be at the house in about 20 minutes. Anyways, in about 5 minutes she hears a knock on the door. She answers and it's a full SWAT team. She asked, "I thought they were just sending a patroller," and one of the guys told her, "After you hung up the phone, we heard a second phone on the line hang up." Ended up there was a man in the basement listening to the conversation. The lady in the station waited and heard him hang up, then immediately sent the SWAT team to help. They went downstairs and caught him. He was wanted for multiple cases of rape. 10. I saw this little bird walking on the street when suddenly a seagull grabbed it in its mouth. Seagull started to smash this helpless bird against the ground a few times. After a while it ate the bird, and I saw a bump on the seagull's neck like the bird was stuck in its throat. Then it flew off. I was just standing there and said, "What the fuck? Seagulls shouldn't do that. Fuck seagulls." 11. I was playing around with a radio once when I was a kid, just slowly spanning through the static trying to find a station. I'd found an old television antenna, attached it to the side of our house, and ran a wire out my window to it with an alligator clip attached to the radio antenna, allowing me to get a way broader range of signals. So I'm sitting there early in the morning, like 2 a.m., slowly sweeping frequencies, and suddenly I get to the station that's playing this very weird crackling sound. It sounded sort of like cracking knuckles or maybe Rice Krispies cereal, but with a fixed, rhythmic pattern instead of being random. I sat there listening to it for a second, then it suddenly stopped and his faint voice says, "It doesn't work. We're already dead. We're already dead." It took a second for the weight of the words to hit me, but when they did, I freaked the fuck out and almost threw the radio across the room. I'm pretty sure it was just someone messing around with a radio transmitter, but damn it if it didn't scare the shit out of me at the time. 12. My dad died of cancer the day I turned 16 after about 2 weeks in a coma. It was really fast, less than 2 months between diagnosis and death. He died in the house. We had a hospice attendant, and my mom was very good about seeing to him in those final days. Anyway, a lot of weird shit happened after he passed. But the one that still freaks me out when I think about it happened about 12 hours before he took to bed for the last time. He was in our living room napping on the couch while my mom was in the kitchen cooking. No one else was home. Suddenly he jerked awake and was shouting for my mom in a very loud, agitated voice, clearly angry with her. "Beverly, don't do that! Don't ever do that again!" She ran into the room, alarmed, and asked what he was talking about, and he said, "Don't do that. Don't walk past me like that in that long black wig." Sometimes I think he saw death. 13. This was a few years ago on a night scuba dive. There were 8 of us in the group, including our dive master and his assistant. We had just finished our dive and were gathered up in a circle, ready to ascend and get out of the water when my dive master freezes. He takes his flashlight and, pointing it outside our circle of divers, he catches something circling us with the beam. Turns out it was a 12-foot-long great white shark. At this point, half of the group are trying to keep the shark illuminated as it circles us, and remarkably, everyone stayed calm. The only things going through my mind were iterations of these 2 thoughts. Don't look like a yummy, delicious, fatty seal, and I hope I taste terrible. My dive master gets our attention and slowly puts his thumb up, and then makes an upward motion. We all begin to ascend, and the shark kept with us, until we were maybe 10 feet from the surface. Then it turned off into the darkness and was gone. I did not go back into the ocean for about a week after that. 14. The scariest thing happened to me in an old house I used to rent back in 2008. I came home from work one day and heard a blood-curdling scream come from my crawl space. The entrance to my crawl space was in my coat closet in the foyer. The hatch to get in was still shut, but there was a trail of blood leading up to it, and bloody scratch marks all over it. I knew there was nobody else in the house because my roommate was in Atlanta on a business trip all week. Then around 1 a.m., heard the shower was on. I first thought it was my brother. He works night shifts, so thought he had came home late and was in the shower. It went on for about half an hour until I got up and went to see what the fuck he was doing. No one was in the shower. My brother wasn't home yet. I was the only one in the house. Still to this day, I have no idea how it turned on or who did it. Almost 5 years later, I still think about it and shit myself. Even writing this now, I feel like turning every light on in the house from there. My parents were horrified, more so because they were newly pregnant and couldn't imagine going through such a thing. They eventually pretty much forgot all about it. Life went on. They were in love with their new life and their new house. In preparation for the baby, they decided to wallpaper the nursery. Now, my dad told my mom there was no need in wallpapering the inside of the closet, but she insisted. She was kneeling down, scraping off old paint inside the closet, when her eyes fell upon something that made her blood turn to ice. Written in crayon, and about eye level for a kindergartner, in childish scrawl was, "I killed the baby." But very puzzling and unsettling. When the woman returns, I mention it to her, and she laughs and says she gets ghosts all the time. I'm a fairly skeptical person, but honestly, ghosts were the best explanation. The next time I was over, I was pooping around 10:30. The house itself is fairly old and creaks from time to time, but nothing too loud or disruptive. While I was pooping, there comes a single loud knock from the other side of the bathroom door. This wasn't a little creak or pop from the house. It was a loud, determined rap on the door. It was enough to scare my poop back in for the rest of the night. 18. One of the scariest things I ever heard was when I worked in retail. My store used to do layaway, and that was where I worked. Right by the layaway counter, we had 3 bathrooms, a men's multi-stall, a women's multi-stall, and a family bathroom. Well, only the family bathroom had a door that locked. All the others had the push-pull swing door. I was in the back cleaning up, and I thought I'd hear screaming, so I walked out front by the counter. I heard more screaming. I was not sure at first where it was coming from. I ran and checked the men's and women's bathroom, and they were empty, and I still heard the crying and screaming. It was coming from the family bathroom. I banged on the door, but the yelling, screaming, crying kept going on. It sounded like a child, and I had no idea what was going on. I called for a manager because I had no way of getting in the door since it was locked. This whole time there was still crying, screaming, banging. After several attempts of trying to open the door, we called 911. We had no idea what was going on, but it didn't sound good. I think about 15 minutes at this point, although it felt forever. Then the sound check stopped. No more banging, crying, nothing. We banged on the door until the police came. When they finally did, they had to kick the door in since we had no key. As we all stood around and looked in, all we saw was blood all over the place. We were not really sure what happened at first, but the police told us to back up. And that is when they pulled out a lady and a child. A bloody child, maybe 3. We all just stood there in shock. The child was not moving. We thought he was dead because of all the blood. They took the lady away in handcuffs and the child to the hospital. We all had to give statements. Later my manager told me what happened. She just snapped because he wouldn't stop crying and she just had enough and did whatever she could to make him stop. The child did live. I was sure he was dead, but he wasn't. She just knocked him out from hitting him so hard. This story is not scary in the ghost sense, but for that to happen right behind the door and not know what is going on or be able to help was pretty scary to me. $1 a month off the rent if I resigned. That would have amounted to nearly a month of total rent over the course of a year. I thanked them but declined, opting instead to live in a newer place. Flash forward a couple of years. My friend is having a party. He invites some coworkers that he used to work with at the state. I'm talking to one dude about all the places in Albany I had been in. He's lived in several too. After some conversation, we find out that one of his friends used to live in that exact same apartment before me. I've never told anyone about the music and banging I would hear there, but I just have to ask this guy if his friend ever said anything about the place being haunted. His eyes light up when I ask him. "You're not going to believe this," he says, and starts thumbing through the contacts list in his phone. He dials his friend. When the guy answers, he gives him a brief overview of the conversation we had been having, then hands me the phone. "What's up, man? Yeah, I lived there in 2003. You heard the music too? That was the landlords having sex below you. I swear to God. I actually asked about it the morning after I heard it for the 10th time. The old man sheepishly explained that he was banging his old lady. He apologized and said they'd keep it down. The funny thing is, it seemed to get louder and louder over the last couple of months I lived there. It was almost like they wanted me to hear." The mystery was solved. The organ music I had heard was literally organ music that the old people would have sex to. Somehow, that was creepier than it being ghosts. Okay, sure. Weird, but oh well. Max heard it too, so at least I know I'm not crazy. About 20 minutes later, I hear the door open again, and this time Max starts growling like crazy. I quiet him down again and just assume it's the wind or something making noise, even though by this point my heart is racing. I hear footsteps come up the stairs and think, oh geez, Dad is really home this time, and hop up and run to the door. It starts to jiggle, so I run faster to let him in. I peep through the hole, and even though my hand is loosely around the jiggling handle, there's no one on the other side of the door. Terrified, I go hide on the couch with all the lights on. Max is still growling. About an hour later, after that, I start to feel a little better, even though I'm still terrified. Then I hear the door handle jiggle again. This time it was Max jiggling it. He needed to go outside, and the only way outside is through the garage. Fantastic. I literally sprint with him to the kennel, and as I'm standing in there, I decide to ask this thing questions to make myself feel better, because I knew it wouldn't answer me. Thinking about what to ask it, my eyes are drawn to the huge heavy oak door on the kennel. It was always open because it was too heavy for me to move easily. I said, "Okay, ghosts, if you're real, you'll shut this heavy door." Nothing. A minute goes by. Nothing. Max is still sniffing around. I turn around to yell at him to hurry up, and then from behind me I hear click. I whipped around and saw the giant door had swung shut and latched. Okay, clearly it was just the wind. It wasn't really windy, but it was the wind for sure, had to be. I proceed, "Okay, ghost, that was the wind. If you're really real, you'll open this massive door back up." Nothing. I relax a bit and then squat down with my head on my knees, reminiscing about how lame I was just being scared when I hear click, clack. The door was now wide open. Max was done, so we booked it back into the house, locking every door in the house. For the next 4 hours, I would hear footsteps on the stairs and the door handle jiggling every few minutes, until finally around 11 p.m. my dad walks in and yells at me for wasting electricity. I never told him or my mom about it until about 4 months later, when my dad came in from hunting after dark. He looked shaken, and I asked him what was wrong. He said he aimed at 2 deer but missed both completely because it felt as if something was hitting his elbow and making him shoot way above the deer. That's when I told him everything. Up in emergency housing. Basically, we went to charity, who found us a house that we were able to rent for $100 a month, but only for 3 months. That summer, my mom and stepdad separated temporarily, and my 3 younger siblings would go to my stepdad's for a week or so, and then come back to my mom and me. This house was fucking creepy. It started off with just that feeling, like something isn't quite right, that you might not be the only person in the room. In the day, that's all it was, the feeling that something was up. Your instincts pricking at you. I tried to ignore it, but as soon as dusk arrived, shit would start happening. More than once I could hear the static-filled music playing, but I couldn't find the source, it just filled the halls. I heard whispering and went to my two sisters' rooms. In the open closet, a pair of eyes looked at me and disappeared. My brother spent one night in the house and didn't come back. In my room I could never win. On one wall, a mirror, when I flipped over to face the window, I watched tall shadow figures pace in front of it. In my mother's room, the same shadow figures paced in circles around her room. One night, she and I sat up for 2 hours in her bed watching these shadows. She was strongly religious and didn't know what to make of it. During the time we lived there was a lunar eclipse. I'd never seen one before and was very excited for it. When I went out to look, every time, this terror took over me and I couldn't stay inside. I couldn't explain it. When the moon was fully cloaked, I went outside, looked up, but my head suddenly snapped down and to my left. I could see 3 tall shadows walking in between the tall pine trees in the yard. Panicked, I ran back inside and into my room, flinging myself under the covers with my eyes shut tightly, but listened to the pacing outside my bedroom window. 3 months of this. We moved out at the end of summer into a new house. My mom and stepdad got back together, and I was with my younger siblings again. We all agreed the house on Acorn Street was fucked up, and still get chills when we drive by it just to see. Worried, thinking that everyone was gone and they'd left me alone, until I heard a noise above me coming from the second floor where the bedrooms are. Relieved, I darted toward the stairs and jumped on the first step. Then I felt it. There was something in the back of my head making me stop, legs still raised up as I prepared to move on to the second step. Something telling me that I shouldn't go up there. Of course this thought was running rampant in my mind. Don't go up there, don't go up there, stay down here, don't go up there, there's something up there. Finally my leg dropped before I could remember. I pushed myself up those stairs, and even though I didn't want to anymore, I couldn't stop myself, only slow down. Each step up was taken at an agonizingly slow pace, and I wanted so bad just to go back downstairs and find someone, run to my grandparents' house and stay with them until my mom was home. But eventually I rounded the corner, leaving only the last few steps leading up to the floor ahead of me. There was nothing there. I couldn't see anything in the stairwell. I started getting hopeful at this point. Maybe it's okay. Nobody's here. I was just imagining things, and it's going to be fine. I'm still taking the slow steps up when it appears. Something's there. I can't actually remember what it was, and I never could after I woke up. But it was horrifying beyond belief, and I would always try to close my eyes, because that was my thing as a child. If you can't see it, then it can't see you. But I could still see it. I couldn't blink, I couldn't shut my eyes. It was like my eyelids weren't working. I would even try holding my hands in front of my face, but I still couldn't block it out. I could see through my hands. And I couldn't do anything. I was frozen, unable to do anything except stare at this thing all but a meter away from me. Whatever I saw, whatever I did, for those 8 years I was at that house, I had to force myself up the stairs. Day or night, it was horrifying. My mother sighed and tried to reason with me. My father growled at me and called me a coward, and my sister just laughed and said I was retarded. But every time I had to go up those stairs, as soon as I hit the top stairwell, I had to stop and make sure I could cover my eyes with my hands, or that I could shut my eyes. Of course it would terrify me most when I'd go blink and wave my hand in front of my face, and it wouldn't work, and I'd realize I was dreaming. She was about 45, but looked much older. She would sit up all night listening to Christian radio shows and talking loudly to someone. It got to the point where I couldn't sleep, so I went over to her place and asked her to keep it down. She opened her door and I got a quick peek. Her walls all had crosses painted on them in different colors, and words like Jesus and angel scribbled everywhere. The windows were painted black, letting no light in at all. It was damp, yellow-stained 50-year-old carpets, dog shit, and cockroaches everywhere. No dog, though. I asked her to please keep it down. She just looked at me and shut the door. Then she turned up the radio even louder. The next night I had my girlfriend staying over. I wake up in the middle of the night and see a shadow of a person next to the bed looking at us sleeping. I think I'm hallucinating, as I usually do in the dark when I'm sleepy. But then the shadow starts talking. It's my neighbor, and she's holding something in her hand. She broke in during the night, and who knows how long she stood there. "You should lock your door at night," she says, and walks out. The next morning I hear someone making strange noises below my bedroom window. It's my neighbor talking to herself in tongues. She has a plastic bag in her hand with her rotting dead dog inside. It's hot as hell outside, and I can smell death from the bag. At this point I'm scared shitless. She's obviously very insane. I go upstairs and knock on another person's door and ask what the hell is going on. The guy is as scared as me. Apparently she broke into his apartment one evening as well while he was watching TV with his kids. He got up from the couch to get a snack, only to find her behind the couch staring at him holding a power drill. Now I know what was in her hand. At this stage I'm basically pooping myself. I call the cops and they know all about her. Apparently she's a violent schizo and she hasn't taken her meds. But they can't force her to enter her apartment without her permission, because she owns it. The only thing they can do is get her when she goes outside. I sit up for the next 2 days waiting for her to run out of cigarettes. When I hear her leave at 2 a.m. to go across the road to the 7-Eleven, I call the cops. They have 3 cars and a special van over in less than 2 minutes. They restrain her and throw her in the van and drive off to some institution, and in less than a minute, it's like she was never there. I never see her again. Still have nightmares about her looking at me in my sleep. One my dog doesn't have, and stood back and watched my dog chase off the 5th. He came back bloody and limping, but no worse for wear. But even with the rabies shot, he started showing symptoms about a week later. Toughest thing I had to do to date was putting that dog down. 30. A few months ago I downloaded a program for my phone, Sleep for Android. I bought the premium version of the app for the extra features to record sound throughout the night when volumes reached a certain threshold. It would activate when I would snore or move around. I would usually spend the next evening going over some of the recorded sounds. Everything was pretty normal until I listened to something out of the ordinary. It was near the beginning of April and I had the apartment to myself. It started out picking up my snoring, and then the hairs on my neck stood up as I hear my doorknob moving. Following this, you can hear my door open slowly. I was confused and a little worried. Everything was still locked up. Nobody came home. The chain lock was still latched on the front door, and my landlord certainly didn't come. I don't use the app anymore. 32. When I was 7, I woke up in the middle of the night with an earache. I decided to tell my mom and stepdad and walked out of my room. Someone was sitting on the chair in the living room, about 3 feet away from my bedroom door. The person looked strange. The face was just kind of distorted, but it was dark and I couldn't see well. "Mom?" I asked. The person shook their head and I started getting scared. "Mike?" The person shook their head again. I decided the best course of option was to go back to bed so I wouldn't have to walk past this person. I climbed in bed and closed my eyes for a second before opening them and seeing the person standing in my doorway, smiling madly and nodding furiously. 31. This happened to me when I was about 8 and still scares me to this day. One evening I went to let my dogs in from the back garden at around 9 p.m. It was pitch black, so I quickly opened the door and my dogs came bounding in. As soon as they came in, I locked the door, and at this moment, a person on the other side pulled the handle down trying to get into my house. We had a glass door, so even in the dark, I could see the outline of a man standing there. I ran to my dad, and he ran into the back garden after this man and saw him running down the road. Since then, I've closed and locked doors at the speed of light. 34. I'm a nighttime tour guide at an old convict prison in Australia. It's run by the government, so the tours are pretty watered down and family friendly. The tours run between like 6 and 9 on Wednesday and Friday nights, and some of the scariest shit I've ever experienced has happened there. I'm not convinced in ghosts and whatnot, but if there are, they're definitely there. Every other person who works there has their own creepy story. My scariest was when I had a group of about 30 people in the gallows one night, the room where people were hanged, and the room was made of corrugated tin, so I was there doing my bit when suddenly there was this huge bang on the roof. Everyone looked up and a few people screamed, but a lot laughed. We have a few actors that jump out on tours, so they probably thought it was that. The banging didn't stop, though. It was kind of irregular at sort of like a half-second intervals, like boom, boom, ba-boom. And people were getting creeped, me included, so I took the group outside. Now the roof of the room is a slanted A-frame, so if you walk back a bit, you can see the outside roof. We all watched as this one bit of tin looked like it was being stomped on from the outside, moving and everything, still banging when I took the group to the next spot. We finished off the tour and a few people thought it was a joke, but it genuinely terrified me. 35. This is creepy. At least I always thought it was. I was working in a big grocery warehouse. Hundreds of people work there. It was night shift. Sitting in a break room at lunch with a couple of other guys trying to find something to talk about to stay awake. I started talking about the best jobs I'd ever had. After a minute or so, this older guy who never ever said more than a word or two at a time starts telling us about this nursing home he used to work at. He was in his 60s, and he'd already been at this current job for 30 plus years at the time, so his story took place when he was a young man, I surmised. He was an attendant for this nursing home, and he told us he used to have sex with many of the female residents. These were elderly ladies and handicapped people as well. He told us he'd usually get it on with at least one of them every night, and they were all very grateful for his attention. He felt he was in heaven at the time. According to him, some of the ladies he was involved with were in their 80s, and all of them were very lonely. He said his favorite was a younger woman who had cerebral palsy or some nerve disorder. He said that although she couldn't walk, he could tell she loved his attentions by the way she'd squirm and wiggle during sex. He told us he'd eventually been let go from this dream job, but not for what reason. When break was over and he left the break room, me and the other guy sat there for a moment, and I asked him if he'd ever heard that story before. He said, "Hell no, I've never even heard him talk that long about anything before." The guy in question was always such a quiet guy, and I switched back to day shift not long after that. So I never talked about it with him again. But it really struck me in my mind in a creepy way. I think he believed what he said. But were these women his lovers or his victims? 36. To really get my story, you have to have an understanding of my third-floor landing. There's a single set of stairs that lead up to it. Once on the landing, it's a T-shape with an office to the left, my bedroom to the right, and straight ahead is a bathroom with a shower. Anyway, one night around 10 p.m., I'm taking a shower before I head to sleep. The glass panels on my shower had this like concave, convex glass that blurs everything, so everything was blurred and unclear. I glance at the door and I see some kind of hand-like figure. Now, it was pitch black, so right there it freaked me out because I come from a family of pale white Welsh people. What freaked me out more was how the hand seemed to come through the door, or at least at an angle where whomever the hand belonged to would be visible. All it did was hit the lights, that's it. No noise, no attack or anything, it just turned off the fucking lights. So there I am, I just witnessed a phantom hand, and now I'm in my shower and it's pitch fucking black. I've never been so chilled to the bone before. Something about being in the darkness of the night with the only noise being the water hitting the floor beneath me just reduced me to the most primal state of pure fear I've ever been in. I eventually get myself to leave the shower and hit the lights. The relief that came over me was immense. I've never been able to explain it. The stairs up to the landing are old and creak like hell. I would have heard someone, somewhere, come and go down. No one was in my room or the office. Weirder still, nothing like it has happened since. 37. Woke up one night to some noise downstairs. Xbox was on and the Kinect was moving up and down every so often like it does when you set it up. Turned it off and went back to bed. Next morning I booted up the Xbox and TV and started Kinect Adventures. Several pics were taken last night of in-game action, but no one was in the pictures. 38. I'm a journalist and was told this doozy by a woman I interviewed for a true crime story. When this woman was a young girl, say 8 years old, she started to come downstairs at night to tell her father that there was a man in her closet. He tells her there's no such thing as the boogeyman and sends her back to bed. This happens on and off for like a week. Finally, he gets frustrated and walks her back to the room and says, "I'll show you there's nothing in your closet," and goes to open the door. It opens an inch and then he feels someone slam it shut. Turns out there really was a man in her closet. This guy was a perv who would come into the house every night and stare at the girl from the closet while she slept. The dad kicked the shit out of him, and the perv went to prison for many years. I researched her story 20 years after this happened. The guy had just gotten out of jail again, and no one could find him. 39. Driving to pick up a friend who was at this cabin party about 40 miles west of where I lived. It was close to 2 a.m. So I'm driving down this back road to find this random cabin somewhere, and I come across this red four-door sedan with all the doors open and 4 limp figures in the seats with their heads slumped over. That alone kind of freaked me the fuck out. Later on, I'm driving by again after a failed attempt at picking up my friend. Mind you, it's getting close to 3 in the morning and only the front seat passenger's door was open, and every person in that car was staring with a blank dead stare directly at me as I drove past at 10 miles per hour. Very creepy to me. 40. I lived on 13 acres. Most of it was forest. I was 8, hardly ever home alone, but when I was, this kind of thing would happen all the time. Only when I was alone. The doors would open while they were locked. My young dogs would run up to the door and stay 10 feet away barking at something I couldn't see while I hid behind the bar clutching a knife. At the same time, my younger sister and I would play in the woods with just our dogs. At 5 and 7 years old, we had an imaginary friend that we both would talk to and could hear what it was saying. Our dogs would follow it when we would walk away and run around it in circles as it moved around. I revisited that house 8 years later and saw a figure moving along the edge of the woods. It looked the same size as our friend. When I told my sister, she told me she saw it too, but no one else did. I didn't realize until I was older that there was no way we both should have been able to hear it, or that the dog shouldn't have been able to see it. 41. I grew up in the South in the late 70s and early 80s. My grandmother lived on a cotton farm in South Carolina, and my cousin and I would go visit her during the summer. We'd help out on the farm, but during the heat of the day we'd go swimming in the river to cool off. Our favorite spot was fairly isolated, so we never really saw anyone else, but there was an old dirt road that ran from the gravel road back to an abandoned farmhouse in the woods. My cousin and I were in the river when we saw a cloud of dust in the distance. We thought maybe our uncle was coming to take us back to the farm, but we always swam for an hour or so after lunch, and he never drove the tractor to come get us. We'd heard stories about some backwoods family who'd gone all deliverance on some kids a few summers ago, but we figured it had just to be our uncle trying to freak us out. Regardless, we snuck up to the riverbank so we could see the dirt road, but we'd still be hidden in the trees. We saw a ratty Oldsmobile Delta 88 with blacked-out windows creeping down the dirt road. The car didn't belong to anyone we knew. I only remember the make and model because I knew it was the Evil Dead car, and because of what happened next. After it passed by our hiding spot, we noticed it didn't have a license plate. It drove another 30 yards or so, and then it stopped. A black garbage bag flew out of the passenger window and into the field. It was about the size of a football. Then the car made a slow and methodical three-point turn, taking great pains not to let the tires venture too far into the cotton field. It made its way back the direction it came until it disappeared out of sight. My cousin and I had remained silent throughout the event, and with the car gone we looked at each other. I wish we would have just ignored it. I wish we would have headed back to the farm. I wish we would have told our uncle or our grandmother what we had seen and had them come investigate it. But we were 13. Curiosity was killing us. We had to look in that bag. As we left our hiding place and headed down the road, we looked around nervously, hoping the Delt wouldn't show up again. As we got close to the drop zone, we could see blood on some of the cotton directly above the bag's resting place. We looked at each other one last time, and then we opened the bag. There, in the bottom of the bag, wrapped in a bloody washcloth, was a tiny baby girl. She looked like she might have just been asleep, but she wasn't. The image of her lying there, naked, bloody, and discarded, has haunted me ever since. 42. Something along these same lines happened to me when I was a kid, but no one was ever found in my basement. It was my first time staying home alone, while my whole family was out at my brother's ball game. I was 13, I think. Anyways, I'm on the phone with a friend of mine, feeling so grown up when someone beeps in on the other line. I tell her I'll be right back and click over lines. Then the creepiest voice I have ever heard says, "Hello, little girl. I'm the man in your basement." Honestly, I laughed it off and just hung up thinking it was a prank call. I was a pretty confident little thing, and my neighborhood was pretty safe, so I figured someone was just messing with me, knowing it was my first time alone. They beeped in again, so I clicked over and heard, "Don't you fucking hang up on me, you little bitch." And the light started flickering and there was banging under my feet. I know it sounds crazy, but my dog started freaking out and my cat ran away, so I assure you I wasn't imagining a thing. Our basement was actually just an area connected to the garage. It wasn't finished. I heard what sounded like footsteps coming up the garage steps to get into our kitchen, and I threw stuff in front of the door and heard yelling and whatnot. I kept trying to hang up and call the cops, but every time I tried to, he was still on the phone. My friend told her parents what was happening, and they ran to a neighbor's house to call the police for me. I sat petrified with a broken rifle, a butcher knife, and a baseball bat behind my front door because it's the only place in the house downstairs that couldn't be seen from a window, crying. Eventually I clicked over to hear a police dispatcher on the phone and stayed on the line with her until the police got to my house. There was no sign of forced entry, though we had a broken window pane on our outside garage door that had been messed up for months prior, and my guess is he used that to get in. The police assumed I was just a paranoid girl, and they were going to leave me home alone after they gave an all clear. Fortunately, a family friend had been driving by and saw the cops there and stopped to see if everything was okay. He gave me a ride to the school where my family was. They were skeptical that anything had happened, but we did get a security system not too much longer after that, and my parents both got cell phones too. This was '94, I think, so cell phones weren't super popular yet. After that happened, I swear there was someone stalking me for years. I would leave my apartment locked and bolted and come back to find appliances on, hairdryer, stove, heat on in the middle of the summer. I lived in 4 different places and would get strange phone calls at everyone, despite being unlisted. Cars would randomly be parked down the road from a house and speed up and slam on the brakes as I would run inside. I'd hear loud bangs outside when I lived out in the country. Nothing has happened since I've been in my current house and married, but I am still super paranoid all the time. 44. I used to work night shift security on a college campus 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., usually by myself. If I was lucky, I'd have a work-study student officer with me until 2. The campus had been around in one form or another since the Revolutionary War. Started as a wood fort, then stone, then finally a concrete fortress with dozens of brick buildings until the end of World War II, when they decommissioned the fort and turned it into a college. There's one building on campus that used to be an officer's quarters, a really fancy, rather upscale 3-story house. The place has all the classic ghost stories, lady in white, shadows moving on their own, footsteps, etc. I never believed them, until I experienced them. Temperature drop. My first experience in there, I was still on second shift during the day. It was maybe 4 p.m. I remember the sun was still out. It was also in the 80s outside. I was crossing the main lobby, a large room in front of the double staircase, when I realized something. It was suddenly way too quiet, like the air was heavy and pressing down on me. I stopped walking for some reason. Then it got cold. Really cold. It must have dropped about 20 degrees. Needless to say, I booked it before I heard or saw anything. I've seen horror movies. Fuck this. The Scream. Another experience with this place. Screaming. I was escorting a couple of new officers to show them how to lock the building. We were standing in the lobby, everything seems to be focused there, talking to the last guy in the building. 4 of us standing in a group when all but one of us heard it. Shuffling. Like something being dragged in short spurts across the floor directly above us. Scrunch, scrunch, scrunch. Aye! A woman screamed. But there was nobody up there. I wanted to check it out, but the female officer I was next to was too creeped out. The child laughing. It must have been a few months after the Scream incident. I hadn't gone through there much since then. I was escorting another new guy and had just finished telling him the story about the Scream. We were standing next to the back door. Once again, this room was directly connected to the lobby with a rather large arch connecting them instead of a door. As we started walking into the lobby, a familiar feeling crept over me. It was quiet and heavy. That's when we heard it. I'm pretty sure I heard the pitter-patter of little footsteps, but we both heard it. A little girl, giggling, on the floor above us. The building was empty and already locked up. We were doing second checks. There was no way somebody else was in there. The previous patrols would have found them. We looked at each other. Welp, booked it out the door. The woman in black heels. This one is the last thing I experienced in that building. In fact, it's the only thing I saw outright. I was working alone that night. There were still 2 staff members in the building, one in the basement, one at the front desk. As I was locking the doors, they were finishing their tasks and getting ready to leave. I double-checked the building, turned off some lights, and started crossing the lobby when I looked up the staircase. The staircase runs parallel to the lobby. It goes up half a floor to the landing, then the rest of the way in a switchback setup. Like this, but with another set of stairs on the other side of the landing, too. There was a woman up there on the second floor. All I could see was the bottom of a black skirt, her legs, and black heels, walking from the right to left. She was wearing heels, but there was no sound, and even though she was walking at a regular pace, I blinked, and she was gone. I didn't believe in ghosts until I became a security officer on the night shift. I've experienced some shit, and most of it with witnesses. Then there's the stuff you really wouldn't believe, when there was nobody with me to confirm it. Once again, night shift, without coworkers, like the face in the bushes, or the shadow of a soldier on top of the old fort. But I'll keep those stories for another day. 48. I was about 7 or 8 years old, and normally after school my mom sets up the tub so I can have my afternoon bath. Keep in mind that my bathroom was tiny, and there was no room for someone to hide in without being spotted immediately. So my mom watches me go in the tub, gives me a toy, and walks away to the kitchen to finish cooking. I wanted to splash around in the water with my toy, so I closed the glass sliding door of the tub. As soon as I closed the sliding door, it quickly opened on its own. My tiny little mind couldn't fathom how that happened. A few seconds later, the sliding door rapidly opened and closed for a few seconds. I started screaming, and my mother ran to the bathroom to find me crying in the tub. I told her what happened, but she didn't believe me. The sliding door was closed when she found me crying in the bathroom. For over 20 years it bugged me. Was it part of my imagination? It felt completely and entirely real. 49. When I was around 6, my family lived out in the rural desert in Southern California near a Cahuilla tribe reservation. We had a few-acre ranch that was beside a small mountain or a large hill. My room had large windows that faced toward the mountainside, and as such, it was always extremely dark at night. So there was a motion sensor porch light that was attached over the back door, which you could see from my window. Think of an L on its side. The back door led to a room we never used, but anyone coming to the property thought it was the front door. Anyway, one night while trying to sleep, I hear a tapping on the window like a subtle scratching. I wake up and see two very striking yellow eyes and the silhouette of something at the window, very canine. Now, we had coyotes here, but this was the size of a small man, far larger than any coyote, and there were no wolves in the region. We had a dog, but a border collie was nowhere near the size of this. So we stare at each other for a few moments, just dead still. I'm completely frozen on what to do while it just stares back. It begins to scratch again at the window, then turns and walks upright to the back door and tries the handle. The light goes on, I see this furry dogman thing trying to get in, and I freak. I remember running out of my room and grabbing a rifle we had in a case in the living room, like 15 feet away from the door, and then running back to my room. There it is on the other side of the glass looking at me. It sees the rifle, then bolts into the dark. I never knew what it was, and I only learned about skinwalkers much later. Never told my parents, but I slept with that Winchester rifle beside my bed for a few years after. Coming down the hospital hallway, and he looked kind of annoyed. He walked right past them into the patient's room, slamming the door open. My wife caught the door on the backswing and marched right into the room after him, respiratory therapist right behind her, planning on dragging him back out and giving him a piece of her mind. When she got in the room, he was not there. No sign of the person she followed in. She looked under the bed. She looked in the bathroom. She checked behind all the curtains. She even made sure the window still would not open. No sign of the farmer at all. She then noticed the patient was sitting upright in the bed, just kind of staring off into space. So she asked her, "Did you just see someone come into the room?" The patient said, "Yes, it was my daddy. He said he was coming to take me home tonight and you mean people won't be able to hurt me anymore." She responded with, "That's great. How about you get some rest before he comes to pick you up?" The patient then lied down and went to sleep. The patient died that night. My wife and the respiratory therapist swapped stories to make sure they were not crazy, but they both saw it. 51. My parents were out one night and my brother and I were home alone. We were probably 12 and 10 respectively. Anyway, there's a knock at the door and I hear a voice say, "Pizza." Initially thinking it was my father playing a joke, I instinctively went to open the door when it hit me. That wasn't my dad's voice. "We didn't order any pizza," I said. There was no reply and no audible movement. I went to my bathroom window, which allows some vision of the footpath leading from the front of our property to the front door, but you can't see the door itself. So we waited for about 15 minutes, clutching a cricket bat and some ornamental fireplace poker, until finally the dude moves away from the door and walks away. Just some guy with dark hair and a long ponytail, a long dark coat, and no pizza. 52. One morning I woke up to my grandmother calling my cell phone. I was upstairs and it was weird for her to call me. "There's something wrong with your father." So I came downstairs and she was in the hallway looking toward the living room where my father was on the flat of his back, not moving. I went to him and tried to see what was wrong. He was cold. I ushered my grandmother into the kitchen to sit down and called 911. In the meantime, I started CPR. He was down for hours, must have died during the night. There's a certain type of desperation when you're doing CPR on your own father. I've done it before when being trained and a few times over the years in emergency situations, but this was different. I was doing CPR, and the phone was on my shoulder, and I was telling my grandmother everything was going to be all right, at the same time trying not to lose it myself. Then a big mouthful of cold, dead black blood came up. I'm not sure how much I swallowed. I know some went to my sinuses and came out my nose. This froze my entire soul. I could taste my father's cold, dead blood. My brain shut off dead for a minute. I don't remember getting up and going to the sink. In that missing time I had gotten up, went into the kitchen, and was trying to wash this blood off of my face. I had my grandmother behind me asking what was wrong, but I couldn't talk. I couldn't even think barely. I was just trying to wash that smell, that taste out of my mouth and nose. That was 4 years ago. I still wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, and all I can smell or taste is my father's dead blood. I hid this for years. I kinda had a mental breakdown and lost it for 2 years. Didn't tell a soul. Eventually I told my boyfriend. I had an irrational fear if I ever told him he'd never want to kiss me again. But he did. so that's okay. I hope I'm never in another situation where I have to do CPR, because I don't honestly think I could do it. 54. I grew up in a house that was creepy as hell. Everyone saw shadows move, everyone lost things, everyone heard voices in that house. People who had never heard the stories about it would come into the house for the first time and comment on strange things. One night during the summer, I'm laying awake on my bed trying to fall asleep, but I can't. It's too hot and feels weird in the room. I'm on my right side, then my left, then back again. This whole time my brother's singing and tapping in the bunk above me. Finally, pissed, I reach up to push up on his bed. I would do that in retaliation when he was loud. As I roll onto my back, I feel a hand through my mattress. It started at my neck and swept down my back, pushing the mattress as it went. Scared the ever-loving fuck right out of me. I never did figure out what the hell that was. 55. Here is my creepiest moment. Worked as a security guard in a hospital when my coworkers received a call from a woman who found a note from her husband. In that note, he wrote he was going to kill himself, and he also noted the exact area of where he would do it. Toilets. We thought it was a prank call, but obviously we still had to check it out. Men's toilets were clear, next were the women's toilets. Fuck, one door locked. Also no response to our yelling and knocking, so we yelled we were going to open the door. And we unlocked the door with the side of the key and opened it. What we saw there was absolutely horrific, not so much as in the gore, but the way he took his own life. We found the man lying on the floor with a plastic bag taped around his head. Every item in his pocket was placed on the toilet: phone, cigarettes, lighter, wallet, etc. My colleague checked his pulse, but he was already cold. So we were too late. We contacted the police, and my coworker had his wife on the phone the whole time, trying to comfort her, as she wasn't allowed to tell anything about the state of her husband. That was up for the police to tell. Anyways, police removed the tape and found another plastic bag under the other one. When they removed the second plastic bag and tape, we saw he also had put pieces of paper in his nose. So yeah, this guy was a patient of the psych ward and decided to kill himself by suffocation. Anyway, never took a dump on that particular toilet again. Neither did my coworkers. 56. My parents were drug addicts. When I was young, we had a nice home, but slowly, as I matured, we started living in shittier homes. When I was a teenager, we rented a decent-sized but run-down house in a weird neighborhood. On moving day, we set out exploring, excited to see that the unfinished basement at least had a semi-finished laundry room. Underneath the stairs in that laundry room, there were some childlike drawings on the walls. A picture of 5 family members, including a baby, with the caption, "Our New Home." It was a little weird, but whatever kids draw in random fucking places, we just covered up the art and used the laundry room. That basement was super creepy. There was always a feeling of something watching you. All of us experienced some kind of weird thing in that house. Now, I believe in ghosts because of an earlier experience I've had in a much older house, but I still remain skeptical. Everyone who stayed with us or visited us reported hearing a voice of a little boy behind them at random times during the day. It was always the same thing, rah! The noise that little kids always make when they are trying to scare you. We all kind of ignored it, dismissed it, or lived with it. One day I was home alone and sitting on the computer doing my online classwork when I started to hear this weird buzzing noise. I ignored it for a while, but it just kept going, this steady buzzing noise. No one was home, even my dog was gone. I waited until my dad came home from work and fell asleep on the couch and decided to investigate. By then the noise had been going for about 2 hours. I eventually followed the noise downstairs and saw my dad's electric hair clippers turned on and just buzzing all over the bathroom floor. I was really confused as to how this happened. I turned the clippers off and heard an impatient sigh come from the other side of the basement. Not thinking, I just said sorry and noped the fuck out of there. I got back upstairs and woke my dad up and told him he left his clippers on, hoping for an explanation. He told me he lost his clippers weeks ago and told me to get them in the basement. The last thing that happened was something that really cemented the fact that there was something weird in that house in the minds of our whole family. My brother, mother, sister, and I were all getting ready to leave the house. Keys in hand, shoes on, and all of us walking toward the door. My brother stops at the fridge and says to us, "I'm going to take this last Pepsi, okay?" All of us heard from the basement a distinctly childlike voice. I'd say a boy around 4 or 5 shout, "No!" in direct response to this question. It was so clear. It was that bratty toddler "no" that so many parents are familiar with. We all solemnly looked at each other, confirmed in each other's eyes what we just heard, and hurried to the car as naturally as possible. That is probably the only house I was happy to hear we got evicted from. 58. This happened just a couple weeks ago on a Friday. It was late at night, around midnight. I had two friends in my car. We were coming back from a restaurant to celebrate finishing up the school play. I just dropped the first friend off and was now making the 4 or 5 mile drive to my second friend's house. It's a narrow road in Massachusetts that cuts through some pretty dense woods. She was in the front seat and we were listening to ballads, just talking about life. Not a big deal. I was behind a deep red pickup truck that had a motorcycle in the bed of it the entire way so far. I wasn't tailgating them, nothing, even though the driver was going a bit slow for my taste and swerving around just a tad too much. When I'm just about to reach this intersection that's not even a block from my second friend's house, this guy pulls over. Seemingly for no reason, he just pulled over to the side of the road about a car or two's length from the blinking red light. As I pass him to stop up ahead, I see his face. He has a pretty generic face, nothing unusual, but he's staring right at us with anger in his eyes. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I just sense something's not quite right. My friend looks out the window and says, "What is he doing?" shakily. I look at my rearview mirror to see the guy getting out of the seat, pulling a ski mask over his face, and wielding a huge, I'd say 10-inch knife in his hand. He started sprinting at my car, almost reaching the passenger's side. I screamed and slammed on the gas, driving around for a while. The man only chasing my car for a few blocks until he knew he wasn't going to catch us. When I got back at the intersection minutes later to drop my friend off, he was gone. My friend ran inside, locked her doors and everything, and I sped away. But it was terrifying. I told the police and filled out a report last week. Never driving at that intersection again. 60. When I was in high school, I'm nearly 40 now, my parents bought a good-sized house for what they paid. They were aware the house had a history, but none of us were superstitious, so they bought it. The history of the house was that a man had killed himself there. The people who lived there in the early 80s had rented the basement of the house to their friend. His wife left him, and I guess the divorce was messy. He didn't die in the house, but in the driveway. He ran a hose from his exhaust into the window of his car. My parents lived in there for over 10 years. We always joked about the place being haunted. The basement in particular just had a creepy feel to it. I never got the whole feels like you're being watched feeling before that, and haven't since, but you just got that feeling. There were always small things going on, creaky floors, breezes, crap like that. Most were dismissible. Here are the stories that stand out. My mother was reading a book in the living room late at night. Sometimes she had trouble sleeping and was going to read until she got tired. This night she was sitting there and heard a metal noise like a ting, then the clack, clack, clack of something hitting the floor. She turned around to see the final skid of a fork as it came to a stop beside her. 3 forks were sitting on a table across the room. She said it sounded like someone had hit the tongs and sent it flying across the room. Everyone else was asleep at the time. Well, after my sister and I had moved out, my sister had a child. My parents bought an automated swing for the baby for when they visited. The swing would randomly swing on its own. The swing would be turned off. It would just be like someone had lightly pushed it. It happened enough that my parents would just kind of mention it lightly when it happened. They'd just say, "Oh, hey, look, the swing is moving again," and go about their day. One night I was staying over at my parents' watching TV. It was about 2 a.m. and I heard a tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the fireplace. The swing was about 7 feet away from there, for reference. The tapping was deliberate sounding, like a person or animal had done it. I shrugged it off and kept watching TV. 5 minutes later, tap, tap, tap. I'm intrigued now. I go to the fireplace expecting a trapped bird. Nothing and no taps. I turn to sit down, and once I pass the swing, tap, tap, tap. I have a better hearing vantage now, and it sounded like someone tapping on the mantel. I walk up to it. When I get to it, tap, 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 loud this time. Nothing was there that would have caused it, and the hair in my arm is standing on edge. Kinda spooked, I turn around to go inside for a smoke before I quit, then tap, tap this time. Instead of a third tap, the swing swung forward like someone pushed it full force. I had a couple cigarettes instead of one. Last one. Back when I was just out of school before moving out, I was up late. I was in the hall when I hear my father yell, "What the fuck?" I ask through the door if everything is okay. He exits the room. He is white as a sheet. He said he woke up and saw 2 old ladies standing at the foot of their bed. They were just staring at him and mouthing something, like talking to him. He said there was no expression on their faces, happy, sad, scared, and no sound. When he yelled, they disappeared. 64. My wife and I just moved into a brand new house this past July. There are definitely creaks and weird noises from the house settling. However, I had a buddy over one night. We'd all got a little drunk, and as we were going to bed, my buddy jokingly knocks on our bedroom door and asks if he can sleep in our house because there's a ghost in his room. Go to bed, Rodney, I say. The next day, after we went home, he told me his girlfriend asked him, "So you called me last night?" He didn't remember calling her, so he checked his phone and there was no record of any new outgoing calls. He told her that he didn't call her, and she said, "That's interesting, because I had a missed call last night from you and a voicemail. Listen to this." What came next was the weirdest thing ever. It was this loud droning noise with lots of feedback and interference. Her phone would translate any voicemail into text, so while you heard this weird growling sound, the text message read, "Help me, help me, are you there? Help me, please." Creeped out. 65. My boyfriend was in the army before I met him. This is by far the creepiest story he's told me. It gave me goosebumps. He lived in a 2-story townhouse, on-base housing, in Fort Hood for about 6 months. Tenants always came and went because of deployments. Weird stuff would happen both at night and during the day, mainly thuds in his bedroom on the second floor and shuffling. He felt uneasy being in his room, so he always slept on the living room couch on the first floor. On the weekends, he would be up late playing Xbox Live, being the achievement hunter he is, and due to insomnia. He wouldn't fall asleep until 5 a.m. One night he was up late on his Xbox dashboard, sitting on a sofa chair smoking a cigarette. His Kinect was plugged in. As many of you know, there's a screen on the bottom right corner that shows an infrared version of what the Kinect camera can see. This lets you know what it's detecting. It's really sensitive and, although at times frustrating to use, surprisingly accurate. This was when the hair behind his neck stood up. He noticed the infrared screen. Standing to the right of him, alongside him, was a solid female figure. He wanted me to add that he has never ever used his Kinect after this, even after moving back home to Chicago. I can attest to that. Haha. 66. My grandmother once lived in an old 3-story house. It was set in the woods, slightly run down. It needed new paint. Some of the floorboards would creak, and the doorways were no longer straight from where the house had settled over the years. The house itself always gave me a slightly uneasy feeling. However, I have an overactive imagination, and at the time of this event, I was heavily into my Stephen King horror phase. I was about 10. The third floor of the house contained 3 bedrooms. One bedroom belonged to my Aunt Beth, who was 8 years older than me and wanted very little to do with my brother or myself. Since we stayed at Granny's during the day while Mom and Dad worked, I think it was a jealousy thing. Granny and Papa dismissed her complaints, but when my other aunt who lived there began to echo her concerns, they decided to investigate. I was there when Granny took Beth upstairs and began searching her room just to prove there was nothing there. The rat traps they'd set hadn't worked, and they owned 3 cats, so mice were not likely the culprit. Anyway, while moving a big dresser away from the wall, they discovered a piece of plywood nailed to the wall. It wasn't even painted. I should mention the dresser had come with the house, as had a lot of the furniture. Granny, being Granny, immediately took a hammer and crowbar and tore off the plywood. Behind it was a small door. I'm not kidding when I say small. It was about 3 feet high and narrow. An adult man would have to really squeeze to get in there. The door was locked, but Granny got it open anyhow. Inside was a little hallway, very dusty, that opened into a tiny room. I could walk in the hallway if I hunkered over. An adult would have to crawl and could only sit in the little room. There was a small chair, doll-sized, in that room. Nothing else. The walls had been covered in wallpaper that was now very yellowed with age. Dust and cobwebs everywhere. I sneezed for days after this little adventure. What we finally noticed, and what still haunts me to this day, was the fresh-looking scratches on the walls of the tiny room and the little hallway. Not scratches, really, more like gouges in the wall. These gouges were in groups of 3, as if whatever clawed hand responsible had only 3 fingers. There was no dust in the gouges. They looked fresh. We backtracked out of that little room, not saying a word. Granny nailed the plywood back in place and moved the dresser back against the wall. And that was that. 2 nights later, Beth moved into her sister's room, and they kept that room locked until they moved out a year later. The house was eventually abandoned. I went back with my group of friends in high school to show them the little room, but the stairs were in really bad shape and rotten. The house was torn down not long after.